Thank you everyone for coming. I'd like to welcome you to today's event. And before we start, I'd like to talk very briefly about our organization, Students for Liberty UK. We are a network of pro-liberty students and student societies, and we basically want to educate and empower you to become the next leaders of liberty in the UK and around the world. So if you're in a campus where there's an already established society, libertarian or classical liberal society or whatever the name, by all means do join that society. And we'd like to support you and your society, giving you resources and giving you access to a network of partner organizations and putting you in contact with a lot of similar societies across the UK, Europe, and the world. And if you're an individual at a university where there's no established group, we'd like to help you out, establish one. Or if you don't see yourself doing that, there's many things that you could do for the liberty movement in the UK. You could be, I don't know, managing social media or creating content or whatever. And we'd love to hear from you. So please do reach out to us. You can find us on Facebook, Students for Liberty UK, or Twitter at SF Liberty UK. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's moderator. He's one of our local coordinators and the president of the LSE Hayek Society. Please welcome Max Marlow.
Hello, everybody. Hi there. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, which is Dr. Eamonn Butler. Dr. Butler is the director of the Adam Smith Institute, which has been ranked by the University of Pennsylvania as the best economic think tank pretty much in the world, I'd say. And given the amount of liberty that they have spread, and under Dr. Butler's directorship, it has spread across the UK and the world. We are completely honoured to have him here. Today, we're going to be talking about basically the history of liberty. And Dr. Butler has been absolutely fantastic in making sure that we are very well informed by these things. In fact, behind me, I have 3 of the books that he's authored for the IEA. And whenever you go to a Freshers' Fair run by SFL, the IEA seem to find their books there, and Eamonn's name is always on the front. The main book we'll be talking about today really will be his 101 Great Philosophers, basically talking about the history of liberalism. There it is. Now, you can buy that from any reputable bookshop, I'm sure, but you can also get it free as a PDF online from the IEA website. So please do check that out as a reference guide. Anyway, so I think it's best if we get on with the show. Now, Dr. Butler, what do you actually mean by liberalism? What is liberalism to you?
Liberalism is a philosophy in which you presume liberty, that you assume that you should treat people on the assumption that they are free, rather than treat them that they need to be led and told what to do and husbanded and parented, and generally cajoled or made to do things that are supposedly good for themselves. That's the first thing. I think there's also a number of other principles, which is that liberals are tolerant of other people. They believe that they have to get on with other people, and that other people's views are probably just as sensible as theirs are. They might just have read the wrong books, but they've got to people have to make up their own decisions, their own minds, and have their own philosophy, their own faith, whatever they want, and you don't really have a right to interfere in that. It's their decision. So you have to be tolerant to their point of view, point out when you think they're wrong, but nevertheless be tolerant about them. And that means, of course, things like free speech. And I think that liberalism also looks at the rule of law, that we should all be covered by the same laws, that the fact that you are in a position of authority shouldn't exempt you from any laws, and that we should, otherwise, legally, we should be treated equally before the law, and that nobody should get special privilege. So there's a number of things like that. And I think also the liberals believe that society runs in a spontaneous order. It doesn't need to be ordered from the top. We don't need somebody issuing commands. It's a natural order. It's an evolution of personal relationships, and that grows and develops quite naturally, and we can get along perfectly well without too many rules. A liberal thinks you need some rules and some government, but not very much. Sorry, I can't hear you.
I've muted myself. Sorry. Sorry. I think what we're really looking at here is this very superfluous system which works so well in terms of human society, human economics. It all sort of melds together and produces this rather beautiful system. But I mean, in your book, you sort of talk about the long and studied history of liberalism, all the way from sort of Laozi in 600 BC in ancient China, all the way through to what seems to be Dr. Eamonn Butler of 2020, of sort of applying these ideas to the economics that we sort of interact with on every single day. So if it's got this long storied history with ideas that work, with sort of empirical evidence demonstrating that liberal countries are, some of the most prosperous for everybody, the most tolerant, they're accepting of the human nature, why do you think there is so much opposition?
Well, it is indeed a long tradition going back to ancient China and going on to, not me, but maybe somebody like Deirdre McCloskey or David Friedman being the modern examples of it, I think. But I think the problem with liberalism in general is that it's hard to understand. It's very easy to say there are lots of poor people about, so we should raise taxes and distribute money to the poor. And it sounds as if that solves the problem. But at the same time, you've got to realize that there are downsides of that if you simply take people's money away, why should they carry on trying to produce things? Why should a farmer be planting a field if you're going to come along and take the crops, basically? Why put in that effort? So there's the sort of incentive structure. And then there's the moral hazard thing that if you say, right, well, anybody who declares themselves to be poor will get money, then tomorrow I shall declare myself to be poor and then I shall get the money. So people, you find that in a welfare state, people actually, this is really true, that people do actually make themselves worse off in some cases in order to qualify for the state support. And so you've got to be mindful of these things. So it's not just a case of taking the easy answer. You've got to dig down and say, right, well, how is that going to work? What's the long-term effects of that going to be? And is it the best system? And the answer is no, it isn't. Yes, well,
I in many ways, we're sort of stuck looking at this long system and asking whether or not people are capable of being able to be liberal themselves, because it is a very complex system. Trying to understand that humans are complex and interesting in their own right, and there are over 6 billion individuals, each with their own stories and their own sort of ideas, and having to try and accept all of that and putting this sort of idea that all of it works well together in this sort of beautiful ballet of the economy and of society. I think that's hard for a lot of people to get their head around, I'd say.
Yeah, you should celebrate that. I mean, for the best part of 70 years, we tried socialism on the planet, and we tried to, or some people tried to export socialism to developing countries, Africa, India, and so on. And what did it do? Well, it built a lot of pretty useless steel mills, but not much else. And in the last 30 years, we've had much more open free trade. And we've taken basically 1 billion of the world's population out of $1 a day poverty simply by trading with them, being open to their goods, allowing them to produce stuff and do their own thing. And nobody has to plan that. It just works naturally that we want to buy stuff and they want to sell stuff. So this is a no-brainer.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, but as we were sort of thinking earlier about liberal thinkers and liberal philosophers, and there's everything, there's from every sort of type. There's everything from legal theorists, such as Grotius and Koch, all the way through to political scientists and economists, Friedman, for example, Hayek, all of these great thinkers. Are there, who would you say your favorite liberal thinker is, as your opinion? And are there any we should be sort of nervous about? I sort of hesitate towards Rothbard and Hopper.
I think my favourite is, there's no question about that, and it's John Lilburne, who lived from 1614 to 1657 in England, and was known as Freeborn John because he believed that people had free rights by virtue of the fact that they were born, and particularly if they were born Englishmen. And he flouted censorship because at the time, if you wanted to publish anything, you had to ask permission from the Order of Stationers, which was basically a government regulatory office. And it was designed to keep down sedition and people coming out with all sorts of views that the king didn't approve of. So he just published his pamphlets on liberty anyway, and was promptly hauled into the secret court of the time, which was the Star Chamber. And in the Star Chamber, he refused to bow to the judges, explaining that you're doing your job, I'm doing mine. Why should I bow to you? We're both equal. He was known as a leveler, not because he wanted to level everybody's wealth or income, but because he wanted to treat everybody level before the law. And he did some other outrageous things in the Star Chamber, which is to ask what the charges were against him. That was really, that wasn't allowed at all. And he refused to sign a document that would incriminate himself. So for all of those things, he was whipped, fined, and put in the pillory. But even in the pillory, he handed out pamphlets to the passing public, for which he was given another 3 years imprisonment. And then during the Civil War, he joined the parliamentary faction, but he was summoned to Parliament for attacking their religious intolerance. And then he was summoned again for saying that a bunch of them were such knaves that they ought to be hanged. And for that, he was banished. And he returned, of course, without permission, whereupon he was arrested again. So he spent a large amount of time in jail defending liberty. So I think that takes a bit of, that's got a bit of gumption behind him. So he's my favourite, I think.
Definitely. So what about people we should avoid, though? Are there any liberal thinkers or philosophers or economists who we should sort of be quite wary of? People who may seek to spoil the tradition?
Well, I think there are many people who call themselves liberals that are really what you might call social liberals, which is that they might be fairly liberal economically, but they also believe that you should cajole people socially, or the other way around. American liberals, for example, believe in a great deal of personal freedom, but they still think that you need to use the power of the state to produce economic equality and all of those sorts of things. So I would be aware of the social liberals. They're not really liberal. American liberals are not liberals. They are traditional left wingers.
Well, speaking of America and this worldwide tradition of liberalism, we're currently experiencing the coronavirus pandemic, as everyone's sort of realised. The entire point of this is liberty from the sofa. So
my wife's on the sofa, so I have to be up in the study. I'm sorry.
You've been banished. But do you think there's going to be liberalism after coronavirus? We've seen huge amounts of state force against populations, many of whom, at least in the UK, we've seen people celebrating state force. Any British viewers may be aware of the police who have been basically harassing people or using drones. This is almost Orwellian, using drones to sort of harangue walkers in the parks, and it's been celebrated on Facebook and Twitter, and they're being clapped outside, for example. So do you think liberalism is strong enough to survive coronavirus?
Oh yes, it's survived many things in its many thousand-year history. So I don't see that this is going to be very much different. We've had wars and disasters and earthquakes and catastrophes and tsunamis, and it's survived all of that. It comes and goes, liberalism. This is one of the interesting things you see looking over its history, that it pops up and then it goes quiet a bit, and then somebody else comes in and starts reviving it, and then it goes quiet again, and then it has another surge. So it does go in cycles, but I don't think that the I don't buy your story, because I think that people are okay with the lockdown because they can see that there are benefits from doing that. And yes, this is something which I can do to help the country in general, help people in general, I should say, and that it's worth doing that. If you extend it too long, or if the police get too heavy-handed, then I think people that trust really begins to break down. And then you've had it. You can't control people like that. So I think there are limits, and I think we're probably getting pretty near to the limits now. So I hope it. But afterwards, I think people will see that you've got to. We have basically ruined the economy in order to try to flatten the curve. And okay, well, there's costs and benefits either way. But what it does mean is that we're going to take quite a big economic hit. Nobody is exactly sure. The way to get out of that, frankly, is a liberal agenda, which is that you reduce regulation, you reduce taxation, you allow people to get on and find their own niche in the new world and explore new things and invent new things and develop new services. That is the way that you grow. It's the way that you've always grown. So I think that there will be an understanding very shortly that we need to do more of that.
I'm going to kind of finish our conversation with a final question, and then we'll move through to a Q&A with the audience, which would be fantastic. Just for that, by the way, if you just want to put your questions in the chat, which is there, I can select some and I'll read them out to Dr. Butler, and he'll give you his best answer. But the final question is this: our audience today is primarily young people, most likely in their pajamas with lots of time on their hands at the moment, unless they've got exams like myself or some others. So what can they do, indeed what can we do to expand liberalism and basically make the world a better place, as you and Mads and Piri have both done?
Well, I think firstly, like us all those years ago, be aware of the awful alternative. I mean, we had the Soviet Union basically, and the stakes were very high when we were students, and the world could have gone communist basically. Now that sort of threat has gone, but there's an insidious power below the surface. You mentioned the lockdowns, but more insidious yet is the sort of corruption of regulation, and indeed of populism, the sort of assumption that the majority ought to be able to decide anything they like, and if they want to tax people who wear purple socks, that's just fine. So that I think you've got to be aware of. And then secondly, I think, yeah, do immerse yourself in the story and the arguments. There's some amazing, interesting liberals saying interesting things over thousands of years, and it's an interesting story. So it's helpful to be able to master the arguments and take on the left with a positive viewpoint, rather than just trying to resist everything and saying, no, we don't really believe that, but we don't know what we like. And of course, the third thing is join Students for Liberty and produce content and produce blogs and, you name it, and have a good time.
Or just retweet Adam Smith Institute as much as you can and come to TNGs if you're in London. I think that's also a good one. Right, I'm going to move through to questions. Tom Spencer, who is at City University of London and is head of the London Neoliberal Group, he has asked this question. I've seen lots of people arguing that the views of JeanBaptiste and Adam Smith are a lot more similar than when I've read their respective works. So how would you explain the differences between the two thinkers? And
I don't know I could, because I think I forgot. I'm not sure I can answer that question, because I think I knew there'd be some smart aleck who would ask me, oh, what did JeanBaptiste say on page 42? And I can't answer it, right? Because I wrote this book some time ago and I've completely forgotten what he said. So there you go. I can tell you what Adam Smith says at great length, but I'm not sure I can really answer that question.
Well, we could talk about Adam Smith, for example. Obviously, the ASI is named after him. You're a St Andrews man. You're from there. You even unveiled his statue with sort of the hive of Bernard Mandeville, the fable of the bees on the statue itself. So, I mean, is there anything apart from obviously the liberal stuff? Is there like a key message we should take away from Adam Smith?
Well, I think the key message is the invisible hand, really. It's that the world is a spontaneous order, that markets are spontaneous, and you don't realize at the time you are just in the market trying to get the best deal. but that very system produces an overall social benefit. It's actually, on another point, it's actually quite interesting to read The Wealth of Nations, and you don't really actually have to look past the first page, because on the first page, everybody had always assumed in 1776 that the wealth of a nation was the amount of money that was locked up in its coffers and bank vaults. And Smith was basically saying, no, it's productive capacity. That's its productive people are its wealth. And on page 1, he says, basically, the wealth of, first sentence, wealth of a nation is the productive capacity of its people. Right. In the first sentence, he's got the idea of gross national product, which we still use today. In the second sentence, he says, of course, it depends on how many people there are in the country. Okay, gross national product per capita. Then he says, in the third sentence, and of course, it depends on how many people are actually working, because some of them might be too old or some might be too young, blah, blah, blah. Right, so now he's got productivity. Right, so in 3 sentences, it's revolutionized economics, and it's, you know, it's a great, one of these great Scottish openings of a book where you put the whole thesis right in the first paragraph, so you can't miss it.
Really wish my readings for university were like that. I've got to trawl through pages of rubbish to get through the main stuff.
I put my glasses on and see what JeanBaptiste says now.
Well, we can move on to another question. This is from Chloe Dobbs, who is a first year PPE student at Pembroke College, Oxford. She said,
"Budding politician."
Mudding politician, I know. Well, PPE, it's even worse. Nonetheless, many argue that the use of coronavirus tracking apps and technology that potentially hinders our privacy could be crucial to stopping future waves of the virus. What would some of your great liberal thinkers think of a surveillance state at a time like this? Do the benefits really outweigh the costs to our liberty and privacy?
Well, Benjamin Franklin, of course, who's one of them, said that basically a society that values security over liberty will get neither. And that's a phrase which was taken up again by Milton Friedman many 200 years later, that if you strive for equality and if you strive for security, you'll end up getting no liberty and no equality and no security. So yes, I think it's a powerful theme in many of the liberal thinkers, that you actually have to understand the principles, and that while you might give up liberty for some temporary security, you've got to be cognizant of the long-term effects of doing that, which can be very damaging.
Now, I've got another question here from Rob Duffy, who is really senior in SFL, and he's sort of behind the Mapping Your Mastery courses on Facebook, which has been helping a lot of us through the isolation imposed by the government. He's asked, in what way does liberalism benefit younger people, and why does supporting liberal ideas offer more opportunity than supporting socialist ideas?
I think young people tend to be more entrepreneurial in all ways, not just in a business way. They tend to be more interested in new ideas. Older people think, oh, I know it all, and I don't need any new ideas. And these young people, they come with these ideas, and we tried that back in 1953, and it didn't work. But young people aren't held back by that sort of thing. They're dynamic. They can look through and see something in the future which is exciting. And that is what liberalism is all about. We want to allow people the freedom to do that. We don't want to trap them in some preconceived socialist notion of how the world ought to be, and say, we've had this vision how the world ought to be, and you've got to play your part in achieving that. Because what happens if it turns out to be wrong? Okay, well, then you've made a major mess up, haven't you? And you've ruined millions of people's lives, right? In a liberal society, individuals can make mistakes, and okay, they learn from it, and so they might not do it again, or they might do things in a different way, which is good, a better way, which is good. But you're not ruining the whole system just because you didn't get everything exactly right. And remember, most things don't work. Most things you try fail. Most businesses fail within the first year, I think. So, and most ideas don't work. So you've got to try things over and over and over again. And as I say, the liberal society is a sort of evolutionary progress, and you try things and you do more of what works and less of what doesn't. I always say, never put off until tomorrow what you can do today, because if you do it today, you might like it, and then you can do it again tomorrow.
Very good. Well, some could say that, socialism hasn't been tried yet. We'll give that one another go, but I think
we've had a pretty good shot in many different forms, and that's no good. No, you see, the thing is that what you've got to be very careful about is people trying to argue the theory of socialism with the reality of capitalism or free markets or whatever you want to call it. I'm very happy to have a debate on the theory of both systems, because I think I can win a debate on the theory. I'm very happy to have a debate on the practicalities of both. Yes, there's lots of things that are wrong with capitalism. There's crony capitalism and big governments emerging and all sorts of monopolies because people sidle up to politicians and get special regulations in their favor and all of that kind of stuff. So there's lots of things wrong with capitalism, but at least it doesn't murder 3,000 people a day, which is what socialism did for 70 years.
I'm going to move on to someone, Eduardo Blasco, who helped me out with the LSE last year. He's a master's student in methodology. He's asked a question about Adam Smith. He said, do you agree that criticisms to Adam Smith for developing the labour theory of value, which was later used by Karl Marx to base his theory of exploitation, is actually justified?
This is Rothbard's thesis. I had a friend who commissioned an article for a book by Murray Rothbard, and was rather shocked when Rothbard said, well, Adam Smith was the first socialist. He was basically laid the foundations for Marx because he had this labour theory of value. I actually think that this is misunderstood, because I think that if you read the text carefully, and okay, Smith isn't very clear about this, forgive him, he was, pioneering, and it was 250 years ago, and, he didn't know things that we know now. But he talks about the evolution of societies, and he's talking about in the initial stage where you don't have capital. There aren't any sort of tools and things really, and he's saying, well, that if it takes twice as long to catch a deer as a beaver, then a deer is going to be worth twice as much. You see, and you think, well, yeah, in a pre-capitalist society, I can see that there's some merit in that. He also elsewhere, of course, talks about supply and demand and markets, and short supply puts the price up, blah blah blah. So he's got all of that market stuff as well. And I think people have just taken the deer and beaver stuff and thought, right, oh well, that's Smith saying it's the quantity of labour. So if we spend a lot of time digging a hole in the ground, it must be worth a lot, which is obviously nonsense. But Marx took that up, and Marx didn't see through that argument at all, and so determined he was to impose his own opinion on the planet that he didn't see the absurdity of it. And I'm sure that Adam Smith would have, if we'd come with that criticism to Adam Smith, I'm sure he would have changed that in a jot.
I'm sure. And I mean, if we brought Abdus forward, and I'm going to take this question from Or El Ami, who said, how relevant are Smith's works to contemporary economics, and did he have any insights into contemporary economics, even contemporary society?
Well, I just said about things like gross domestic product, GDP per capita, productivity. He understood the importance of capital. Again, in the first chapter, we're talking about the pin factory, where 18 people working with specialist tools in an orderly fashion can produce, I did work it out once, it was something like 42,000 times as many pins as one person could. And so yes, that is entirely relevant to today. I mean, there were obviously things that he didn't get, like, you know, we now know about marginal utility and so on, and Smith didn't know, well, why isn't water more valuable than diamonds? Because diamonds are useless and water is vital. Now we sort of understand that with the Austrian economists and the marginal utility analysis. So, you know, he didn't see everything, but then, you know, nobody who's first in their science really ever does.
Mm. Well, a question from Cameron Garden on Facebook has said, why does failed socialism result in libertarianism, in which the same way that failure of socializing results in libertarians? Or is this a...
Say that again, that's very confusing.
Why does failed socialism result in libertarianism in much the same way that failed socializing results in libertarians too?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, well, that's yes, very good. Well, I think probably people who are intoxicated with political systems probably aren't very sociable. I think they probably got their nose in a book rather than in a drink. So, and as for failed socialism, well, does it lead to libertarianism? I'm not sure that it does necessarily. We've had many failures of socialism in Eastern Europe. Not all of them have reverted to, you know, not all of them are like Estonia, which is a gung-ho capitalist country. More of them are all like Poland or Hungary. And the trouble with socialism is that it's easy to make fish soup out of an aquarium, but it's very hard to make an aquarium out of fish soup. And when you're left with the fish soup that was the former failed Soviet Union, it's very hard to put the fish back together again. You've basically got to breed some new fish. And that's not easy to do when, of course, the old guard is still around and the old political parties are still around and many of the old sentiments are still around. And people who are disadvantaged by the new system, the collapse of the old system, say, oh, well, it's so much better. I've had a big pension and I was well off, and now we've got this capitalism and it's terrible. I've got to work and so on. So you can see why people resist it.
Yes. Well, if we talk about complex systems, not just aquariums, but let's say central banking, we talk about the Fed. A question from Toby Fitzsimmons, who's an SFL LC, a local coordinator. He said, what would Adam Smith have thought about the Fed's quantitative easing? Or would that have been so far gone about money printing and, you know, and whatever else? Would he have even had thoughts on that, you know, if we relate it?
He was a bit squishy on banking, actually. Because he was writing at a time when famously the Ayr Bank from Ayr in Scotland, which is, of course, Adam Smith was a Scot himself, and it failed, and it was a catastrophic failure. And you know, many people were thrown out of work and all the rest of it. So Smith says, well, you know, clearly we need some controls on these banks. And what I think he really meant was we need controls on marginal banking. You know, if you don't have if your loans aren't backed by 100% by securities, then you're going to have some potential problems that people will lend too much and they won't be able to resist a run on the bank. Banks are usually okay until somebody gets wind that they're in trouble, and then of course everybody wants to take their money out, and then that's the time when the bank, you know, can't succeed. It has to fail. So as long as everybody's got trust in the bank, that's just fine. And there have been various systems to deal with that. So I think that you know, certainly Smith in his day, you know, he was talking about hard currency, and he believed in keeping the value of that currency and hated inflation. In fact, The Wealth of Nations is an excruciatingly boring book. But luckily, you don't have to read it, because I've done a condensed version, which you can get from the Adam Smith Institute website. So it's probably out there as well, and it's a tenth or less of the length. But in the Wealth of Nations, there's 70 pages on the price of silver, and of course that's important because it's a basis of currency, sterling. So he was very concerned about the price of the currency, but he thought that the banks needed a bit of looking after, and he also thought joint stock companies, I mean, companies with many shareholders were suspect. I mean, we don't, well, some of them are today, but generally speaking, we think that that's a system which has allowed capitalism to spread very, very quickly and wide, and it's worth the risks of people going bust and the creditors not getting their money back.
Well, speaking of risk, Andreas Morrow-Martin, who's the host of this, he's asked the question, which there is actually a book answer to, which is actually just here, written by your colleague Mads. He's asked, how and why did you found the ASI?
Well, it beats working for a living. It's a long story. I'll try and keep it short. There were three of us actually. The third was my brother Stuart, and we were all students at the University of St Andrews. And in those days, in the mid-70s, Britain was going rapidly downhill, and people said that it's going to end up nearer to what was then Eastern Europe, communist. People were really seriously concerned about that, and the trade unions were running everything, and there were strikes everywhere, and all the rest of it. So there wasn't much in the way of job prospects. So luckily we had some contacts in America, because an interesting American had come and studied and taught a bit at St Andrews. He, one by one, we all went over to America, and he got us into Washington, got us into jobs. I must say, in my case, when I was in Washington, I learned a lot about how laws were made, and the sheer corruption of it, to be perfectly honest, and that you would have laws that were hugely long because you had to have something that would please everybody. See, and so all members of Congress, ended up with something positive. I think the great American public ended up with something rather negative, but that's the way it works. So, and we learned a bit about the sort of principles of public choice. And okay, we could have stayed in America enjoying the sweet life and the riches and all of this sort of stuff, but Britain was our country. So again, one by one, we came back with the idea of sharing ideas across the Atlantic, basically, because the Americans were thinking about producing a national health system. We knew the problems with that. Similarly, the Brits, I mean, when I was at university, I was told that the competition in telephones was theoretically impossible. When I went to America, they had it. So we thought, well, there's a room to swap ideas here. So we all came back. But within a few months, Mrs. Thatcher was elected, and then we had a sort of open goal in the UK. So most of our focus was in the UK. That was the origin of it. And to be honest, the Institute of Economic Affairs was a kind of a beacon as well. When we were at university, they were the only people putting out good, sound, free market ideas. And we thought, yeah, this is all great theory. What we need to do is to put that into practice. So that's what we looked at, how we do these things in policy terms, and we turned out to be pretty good at it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's pretty good explanation, actually. So changing the world. Speaking of that, actually, speaking of the ASI, Sam Bowman renamed the institution to be a neoliberal institution, which a change from libertarian. Now, can you firstly explain the difference between those two things, and which of them are you?
There is no difference. We just chose the word neoliberal to irritate Polly Toynbee, who is a journalist on the socialist Guardian newspaper. Because many people think, oh, neoliberals, they're responsible for everything from the Black Death to, I've no idea. But modern art, probably. But we're liberals, but if you say you're a liberal, well, firstly, people might think you're an American liberal, so they might think, oh, well, you're in favor of economic intervention. Or they might, or then you have to say, well, no, I'm a classical liberal. And then they think, oh, John Locke, yeah, oh God, that was 300 years ago. Haven't you moved on? So the best thing to do is call it, well, I'm a modern liberal. Although that term has been occupied by the French, by the left as well. And so we thought, right, well, let's call ourselves neoliberal. Let's take back the term, right? Don't let the left have this. The left came up with the word capitalism as a mark of abuse. They've stolen the word liberalism. So let's, neoliberalism, I don't think they're going to be able to steal.
Seems to me that whenever we get very good at something, let's say liberalism or capitalism, and they're great successes, the left say, well, we'll have that, but that's our new brand now. So can you clear something up as well? Was it Sam Bowman or Madsen Piri who came up with the neoliberal joke, or was it you? And bear in mind, Madsen's watching at the moment, so we'll mark our words very carefully.
I mean, who came up with the term?
No. Who came up with the idea of rebranding? Who was this?
Oh, let's call it a collegiate effort.
If anyone's interested, by the way, All Souls College Oxford, for their fellowship program, actually quoted Sam Bowman on neoliberalism within one of the exams. So we're actually getting somewhere into the establishment.
We've got Ayn Rand on the A-level curriculum too. So things are changing.
Now, when we talk about the history of liberalism, we don't talk much about literature, do we? And would you say Ayn Rand is a good guide for literature within liberalism, or is she someone who we sort of have to pick up? Unfortunately, she's on side, but I don't really want to escape my way through 12,000 pages of
you don't have to. You just have to read my book on.
Well, speaking of this, there's product placement.
There you are. Right. You want to read that, and you know everything. I think that what do I say after Ayn Rand? The huge benefit of Ayn Rand is that she brings thousands of people into the freedom movement, let's call it, because they pick up, as young people, they pick up Atlas Shrugged, usually, sometimes The Fountainhead, usually Atlas Shrugged, and they read it and they think, this is fantastic. This is here's a guy, he's a genius, and he's sticking up for himself, and he's sticking up for other entrepreneurs, and he's bashing up statists and so on, and this is wonderful, and it just shows you the power of the individual. And it's a powerful message to young people that on your own, you can make a very powerful difference to the world. And so she brings in so many people like that, thousands and thousands and thousands. That's the good side. The bad side is that, well, she is very doctrinaire. She didn't suffer people who deviated from her opinions. That, to some extent, has gone down over the years into her followers. So it does tend to be a bit of a religion and rather factional. And that's what put me off it in the 1970s when I was a student. And I only just recently came back, and I thought, actually, I don't buy a word of her philosophy. I was brought up in the English empirical tradition, in the Scottish empirical tradition. So I don't take this objectivism stuff, but her conclusions are wonderful.
Can you give us a conclusion then, in that case?
Oh, well, she's just against. Well, she does believe that you need a government. So she's not a libertarian like that. But she's a very robust defender of capitalism, and indeed in unfettered capitalism. So it's good to have somebody like that betting on your side, because the best form of defense is attack. And if you've got somebody there saying, no, we don't want regulations over people's businesses, we don't want regulations over people's lives, they should make up their own lives, and if they're no good at it, well, it's their problem, they'll soon learn to do something about it. And to challenge the existing sort of ethics of altruism, for example, that no, we don't know how other people are living, actually. They have to make their own way in the world, and fine, if people want to support them, that's great, but you don't they can't come to us and claim that for some reason, because we've got a state and a government, that they're entitled to a bit of your money. Well, no, they're not. You can give them money voluntarily, but they're not entitled to it. So to have somebody, you know, making these sort of robust remarks, I think is very refreshing.
Well, I'm going to finish with one final question from Matteo, who is a final
it's not
year.
about JeanBaptiste, I don't mind.
I don't think it is. No, we're trying to avoid him now. He's a final year PP student at Burn College, Oxford, and president of the Oxford Hayek Society.
Another budding politician.
Society. There we go. Yes, he's asked the question. It's a bit of an interesting question given the book. Is there a marked absence of female voices in libertarian history?
No, I mean, we've just been talking about Ayn Rand, who, I put it to you, was actually female. And there are many others, and I've got some of them in the book. There are people like, let me see, but there's Mary Wollstonecraft for a start. There are lots of Americans as well as Ayn Rand. There were you know, at least two other major libertarian women. You've got the Grimke sisters, who were abolitionists, believed in women's rights, and so on. There are quite a number in the canon, and many of them have very interesting things to say. John Stuart Mill's wife, for example, had produced some amazing stuff. It went under John Stuart Mill's name, but clearly she wrote it on the rights of women. Who were entirely neglected at the time and suppressed at the time. So yeah, they've made a powerful contribution.
Well, in that case, I think we'll leave there. Do you have any final comments about liberty from the sofa, Eamonn? Any words of wisdom?
No, carry on. Believe in liberty, produce liberty, join Students for Liberty. What else do you need to know?
And buy all the books. Anyway, I think we may leave it there. I'm going to put a final message from SFL. So I think I'll say, well, thank you, Eamonn. And so we would also like to thank the ASI for their support, obviously supporting young people with their internships, and Freedom Week, which is something everyone should sign up for, which is definitely amazing, as well as their Young Writers in Liberty competition. I would also like to announce on behalf of SFL that there's another event coming up on Monday, talking to former SFLers, which would be fantastic, who share their stories, their achievements in liberty, and they basically give practical advice. It should be something really interesting and definitely something everyone should stay and pay attention for. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much, Dr. Eamonn Butler of ASI fame. I've been Max Marlow, president of the LSE Hayek Society, and I'm going to wish you all of you a very good day, and keep spreading liberty while staying at home. Goodbye.
Bye.